Chairman, and good afternoon, distinguished guests, delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Hopefully there will be a presentation. Thank you very much to the India Foundation, the Bureau of Police Research and Development, and of course the Government of Haryana for inviting me to be part of this year's Counter-Terrorism Conference and to talk on terrorism and the future. I'm also particularly honoured because I understand it's the first time we've had an Australian representative at this very prestigious event. This is a complex topic. The apparently inexorable rise of terrorism, particularly over the last decade and a half since 9/11, and its almost global manifestation suggests that the prognosis is not good. We are hearing that terrorism will apparently continue its evil spread of violence and mayhem, with tactics freely shared and available via the revolution in global communications, with encryption technologies and even simple social media able to provide anonymity and all kinds of violence gaining acceptability under the guise of ideology. Today, I would like to share with you some observations about the future of terrorism and terrorism of the future to create some debate about these assumptions. And in a room of expert academics, policymakers and operators in the field, I would also like to offer a nod to the sometimes overlooked players in this field, the counter-terrorism experts, and offer some insights into the future of dealing with the issue of terrorism. And to this end, I commend the organisers of this conference for maintaining the focus on countering terrorism, not just on the terrorists. As we have heard, they already get enough free publicity. Two areas in terrorism, the future, that I would like to share with you are tactics and the technical. What we have seen develop from the fields of Iraq and Syria is a transition from smaller guerrilla-style jungle warfare and opportunistic attacks into things that look much more like military-style planning. Not as professional as high-grade military-style planning, but certainly we are seeing this. In the Iraq theatre, we know that part of this comes from estimates of around 30% of ISIS at its height coming from former Iraqi military officers. And you can see their hand in the successful manoeuvre operations undertaken in the battles for Fallujah and Mosul. We're also seeing that this type of planning, although ISIS has been defeated in its attempts to establish a so-called caliphate in the Middle East, translating to its support for other groups, other attempted attacks and plots throughout the world being facilitated by communications means. We're also seeing, interestingly, facilitated by this, the translation of the assault and attack techniques developed in the Middle East into other theatres. The photograph that you can see, of course, is from the Battle of Mosul, where we saw the employment of civilian human shields, but also the use of suicide bombers in something that a military operator would look at in seeing similar to the use of a tank. We're also seeing the use of weapons such as drones, sometimes just commercially available drones, being used in a military context. And the knowledge and the experience gained from the Middle East is now being shared elsewhere. Improvised explosive devices and vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices are things that we're very familiar with in seeing over more than a decade in the Middle East. But these are now tactics that are being spread into other parts of the world, sometimes with devastating effect. An interesting development in the field of terrorism, again coming from the Middle East, is the focus on urban assault. ISIS, for reasons that relate very much to the geography of Iraq and Syria, focused on taking over major population centres and using the vast facilities and resources that they could get from that. And we're seeing that this is playing out elsewhere as well. Also, a focus on attacking members of the public and the civilian society because other targets are hardened. The technical advice, and we'll hear some more from my colleague Mark in particular, I'm sure, about the change in terrorism, and this will develop into the future, of terrorism being particularly adept at taking advantage of global developments that have been established to make our world better. The great advances in communication Unfortunately, like everybody else, this means I can keep in touch with my workplace even while I'm in India. Easy transactions for global finance, and the ease with which we can all travel around the world now, developed for our own benefit and the benefit of all our countries and markets, are things that terrorists and other criminals, like everyone else, are taking advantage of. An interesting development that is of great concern for all of us is the use of dual-use weapons, drones in particular, as I've mentioned, and other unmanned aerial systems, but also particularly through access to the vast resources that ISIS was able to assemble, estimated at the end of 2015 at around $5 billion US dollars. I know that in Australia that would make you a very effective company on the Australian stock market, and many of those assets still remain. They have made it easy for these groups to access black market arms dealers, and also by holding territory in Iraq and Syria, gaining access to weaponry and equipment that had previously belonged to the government. The knowledge of how to use these weapons, which I'll talk about a little bit more, is of great concern for us and really brings terrorism up to another level. An example of this that I'll bring from my region, Southeast Asia, is the attack by ISIS-supported groups in Marawi, southern Mindanao, southern Philippines, back in May last year. This was exactly what all analysts had been concerned about that would happen after the defeat of the so-called caliphate. There was nothing much that you could do to stop ISIS or any other groups like Al-Qaeda and others trying to keep their ideology and their movements alive. But nonetheless, this was a surprise. Analysts question why it was a surprise because they and journalists were very busy explaining that ISIS had actually declared a wilayat, a so-called wilayat, province in East Asia that was centred in the Philippines, and they'd also named a so-called emir of that group. What's interesting, however, is the area that was attacked was one that has been a source of conflict and various extremist movement uprisings and activity for more than 3 decades. My colleagues in the Philippines Armed Forces and Police have spent their careers, and their predecessors have spent their careers, fighting known local groups. So at the beginning it looked like that this was something that was very local, and indeed if we look at the people who were involved, they are local groups. But the impact of this global movement meant that estimates of between 9 to 12 disparate groups, some of them Islamist extremist, others Maoist, others just nationalist groups, were able to unite under a cause that gave them notoriety. ISIS wanted to keep their brand going, and ISIS also provided significant support, planning and finances. So as mentioned, a significant attack in taking over a city of 200,000 people, freeing the prisons in order to have prisoners become part of the ISIS movement, paying prisoners and other members of the public a small amount, mostly around $50 US for their allegiance and to fight for them. And we do know also actually sending people with plans and literally bags of money into the Philippines from the Middle East and from Turkey. Also significantly providing other planning and technical support and significant funds. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were found in various buildings in Marawi when this was liberated, and also hundreds of thousands of American dollars found in the local Western Union. From my country, some interesting developments that have been a real change in the terrorism environment in Australia in the past 18 months. I've listed a number of operations. You might be familiar with the December 2016 plot to undertake what would have been, if it was successful, the most serious mass casualty terrorist attack in Australia, followed in July 2017 by what is now the most serious plot, one that was intended to detonate a weapon on an aircraft out of Sydney. Of all of these, though, the details of those particular effective counter-terrorism disruptions aren't important as much as the difference in what we are seeing. For the first time in the Australian recent experience, we saw very sophisticated and developed mass casualty plots using explosives, firearms and bladed weapons. I would note that Australia's firearm regulations mean that consistently terrorists are unable to access firearms to undertake these plots. The Operation Marksburg there was a case of an electrician who was providing, via the internet, his assistance to ISIS in the Middle East to figure out how to target missiles that they had taken from Iraqi stores. Operation Rosenberg was uncovering a illegal firearms import by people who were related to well-known extremists in Australia. And there was concern that they would eventually be passing these to those people. The arrest in October in Melbourne was of a man who was, again via the internet, managing a website, a pro-ISIS website, on behalf of an American foreign fighter in the Middle East, and also collecting and raising funds. This is unusual in that there is direct ISIS engagement with people in Australia and also support being provided. That said, I wouldn't want to overestimate it because the numbers of people in Australia and the type of support is extremely small. But as we all know here, the impact of a terrorist attack can be devastating. So now on to strategic trends in the future of terrorism. The high point of ISIS has gone, and it's very important for us to note that they have been effectively defeated from what they said that their aim was in the Middle East, and they have left. They don't have this so-called caliphate anymore. But the impact of these tactical and technical improvements and developments made by ISIS and their use of global communications and finances remains and are being used by them as well as other groups. The strategic trend also shows that it's very important for a terrorist organisation to go to the next level in having access to and ownership of territory. It makes them wealthy, it enables them to undertake planning, and particularly in the case of ISIS, it provided the dream that has been discussed here for people to come to support them. Therefore, the focus for all of us has to be on failed and fragile states and regions of failed and fragile states, or potentially fragile areas, to ensure that these are denied to terrorists. Also, what we see is that terrorist organisations now absolutely need organised crime in order to access finances, weapons and other sources. They need it to fund themselves. They also rely upon corruption in the countries and states that they are working in and corruption in the businesses that they work for. And of course, as good terrorists, they always need a cause. What we've seen from ISIS and others is it doesn't really matter what it is as long as they can get some advantage out of it. We've also seen, again, as always with terrorism, the importance of propaganda and information operations. These have been greatly facilitated and enabled by the advances in social media and telecommunications. But it also means that there is a vulnerability, and we're seeing with their demise that there is, with ISIS on the down, the supporters and the ideological alignment with them is breaking up. And as noted in the Australian example, we're also seeing support going both ways. The picture that I've shown there is of a reasonably well-known Australian terrorist. The picture on the left is him in an ISIS propaganda video, which is very well known in Australia and elsewhere. But what I would say is that we should be promoting the picture on the right, which is how he looked after he had been arrested by Turkish authorities. And he's currently, with Australian cooperation and great international cooperation, in a Turkish prison awaiting charges in the Turkish courts before he ultimately awaits charges on terrorist plot planning in Australia. An example, again, of the propaganda changing is a very interesting video that came out in November 2016 at the time of the Mosul offensive. We suddenly saw that ISIS stopped producing their famously slick and beautifully put together videos because the high-value target regime had effectively removed many of their key propagandists, but also they were losing. What we saw at this time, and there's some footage from some of the video from an Australian outlet, was changing back to a narrative that really looks like much more like a traditional terrorist group. Grainy footage showing fighters in a combat environment rather in the dreamed Holy Land. But this was of concern to Australia because intermingled with the video were some pictures of some iconic images in Melbourne, a major city in Australia. And there was nothing explicit about Australia, just talking about people to do what they can, rise up and do things, and also reinventing their image away from the loss of the caliphate. Of concern to us, while there was no direct engagement between ISIS and the eventual plotters in Melbourne just a month later, we do consider that they were inspired by this, which shows the importance of the propaganda. But remember also that terrorists will always change the story to support themselves, because, as was noted very effectively by speakers yesterday, they're not democratic institutions, they're not free institutions, so they don't have to talk about the truth. Another strategic issue, if you look at the list on the left, this is the Global Terrorism Index of 2017, talking about those countries most affected by terrorism. You'll note that India and Turkey are there. That's for a range of reasons, and the type of terrorism and militancy that affects those countries is different, so I'd put them to one side. But I would compare, of the top 7 in that list of those countries most affected by terrorism, all of them are in the top 20 most fragile states in the world as well. What we see from that is that there's an absolute and direct link between terrorism and state fragility. This is probably one of our most strategic issues. The causes of terrorism and also the factors involved in being a fragile state, you can see there, and they tend to cross over and align. This is the foundations that are necessary in any environment for terrorism to thrive. Other issues that we're seeing, and again, if we look to the Middle East in particular, is that there is a blurring of what is conventional warfare. We see that with the many state actors that are involved, and also with asymmetric warfare, the way that the military used to see terrorism. So one of the things facing everyone in thinking about the future of terrorism is how to ensure that those who are countering terrorism step outside of the usual way that we see things, the constructs we have, the way we organise ourselves, and the tactics that we use. We're also seeing, as mentioned, terrorism has become a great unifying factor internationally. I was involved in the ASEAN Defence Ministers Meeting Plus Experts Working Group on countering terrorism, and I observed that it was, when we were working with that group, we had representatives from the United States, China, Russia, Australia, and of course our ASEAN partners, all sitting around the table, sharing the same concerns and developing common ways to work through these, including through exercises. So when we have a focus on what clearly a problem is, there isn't actually any problem about defining it. But we're also seeing that some states tend to work outside the commonly used definitions and understandings to justify other things that they are doing and call them terrorism. This, of course, as mentioned in the previous panel, is one of the reasons why the United Nations and the UN Security Council has never agreed to define terrorism, although the UN Security Council and General Assembly have endorsed many, many resolutions condemning terrorism where we can see clear definitions. We're also using, of course, that it's not only terrorists that are learning from terrorist tactics, but other states are using this as well in order to deny activities and use asymmetric approaches to otherwise conventional warfare. For an example of that and how to deal with it, I'll go back to Marawi and some of the issues that we have from a strategic level. One of the great things about the response to Marawi is that this was locally led with significant international support, and that support was also local. It was our region of Southeast Asia that united in working with the Philippines to talk about what they might want and wait until they had worked out what was necessary in their environment. Intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance is one of the key factors where they needed assistance. Also controlling the maritime approaches to Philippines where we knew that terrorists were bringing in people and money and weapons. Australia and others have been involved in advise and assist activities to support the armed forces of the Philippines, along with many other colleagues, Indonesians, Malaysians and others. Australia in particular is involved in providing urban warfare training, building upon the significant experience that our army has in doing the same for the Iraqi armed forces, including the counter-terrorism division, which has had such great success in Iraq. So this is great, and this is what we're used to seeing in responding to a concerning terrorist environment. But there is a danger of seeing this as a military solution alone. From a Philippines environment, there is a local danger of just seeing this as a continuation of 3 decades of conflict. From a global situation, there is a danger of not understanding the very local elements of what has been going on in Marawi and seeing it just as another extension of global terrorism and counter-terrorism. The challenge in Marawi is keeping that focus on a longer-term solution to the local issues, and of particular concern are the continuing hundreds of thousands of Filipinos who have been displaced from their city. The focus and the challenge for the Philippines government there is to try and address their needs and get them back to normalcy as soon as possible. I conducted some research review a year ago of what was happening in terms of the global counter-terrorism response, and there's essentially a tale in three parts, although when we get to the third part, you'll see there's quite some variety. What's interesting is that we see in the Middle East and North Africa, the epicentre of Islamist terrorism, that there is a lot happening, but most of it is involved, of course, in conflict. There are many, many players, as has been commented here, but there's also very profound and ongoing histories of political instability, profound social divisions in those countries that are most affected by terrorism, and also very significant criminality, corruption, and lack of governance. The problems, unfortunately, go beyond the remit of counter-terrorism and will endure beyond the current battles and the current military focus on terrorism. In Western countries, we had the opposite. There was a very high-profile attention given to terrorism, shock of attacks and plots, but actually very, very few instances of successful terrorist violence. Partly this is because there are very strong political, legal and social institutions that have enabled some very complex responses addressing these range of issues that do give rise to terrorism. The threat is very high, but so is the level of counter-terrorism activity. In between, there are a range of others. Some have histories of homegrown terrorism, and as with the example of the Philippines and others, are facing renewed threats. Our closest neighbour, Indonesia, is one of these. They'd successfully beaten terrorism, are developing a very vibrant economy and society, but their successful work at home is being affected by what is happening in the global environment. Others have long-standing and complex disputes, or they might just be affected by having proximity to conflict. Others, of course, we are seeing some others where there are regional and global actors who are using the conflict to their own advantage, much like the proxy wars we saw during the Cold War. So the future of counter-terrorism, it's important to note that while we've talked a lot about military and police responses, the tension is always between individual rights and protecting the majority, and the balance must be maintained. But importantly, we know how ISIS operates, we know how Al-Qaeda operates, and we know that the tactics and techniques that they are sharing. We can translate and share our experience and knowledge. Those countries that have been involved in the Middle East can share their experiences from their militaries back to their police and can share with other countries that haven't been involved. There's been a lot of discussion about the communications and financial enablers, but they were actually created, in the case of the communications pieces, primarily by US companies, and in general terms created by a range of companies that operate not in support of terrorism. So there are a range of things that can be done, and we've already seen the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism last year successfully uniting from a private sector environment to close down much of the use of social media and hosting of terrorist extremist propaganda. In terms of financial transactions, a joint Australia-Indonesia initiative, the Asia-Pacific Counter-Terrorism Financing Summit, was developed 3 years ago and has brought in banks and financial remittance and transfer companies from around the world, and has gone beyond the Asia-Pacific to include most of the countries that are involved here. We actually can stop the money trail, and we will. Yes. So, in summary, terrorism of the future will have much in common with terrorism of the past. But if we're to succeed in managing it, removing its potency, our global approach to countering terrorism has to change and can't just be like the past. Technological advances in all realms, communications, weapons and commercial, will be used by terrorists as they're used by broader society. We in the broader public sector and civil society need to be aware of this and take responsibility for mitigating it. Finally, terrorism thrives in a power vacuum where there is corruption and alienation, lack of human rights and social mobility, and lack of education. Establishing and maintaining counters to all of these and dealing humanely and effectively with local communities and regions denies terrorism. Thank you very much.